So should we get started? Thank you. So let's start with the first slide. So good morning, everyone. This is Sophia Cao. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Southwest Santa Clara Valley, so which covers the city of Los Gatos, Saratoga, Monte Sereno, and Campbell. So welcome to join us to learn about a very important topic on voter suppression this morning. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization of women and men, established to promote political responsibility through informed and active participation in government. The League has two distinct roles: voter services and advocacy. The League does not support, oppose, or evaluate political candidates or parties. Although our policy does not permit endorsement of political candidates, we do, after careful study, take positions and advocates on political issues. Thank you. Next page. So today, we're going to spend the next 1.5 hours learning about a very important topic about voter suppression. We are very excited to have two excellent speakers, some film clips, and a question and answer period, which will be moderated by our Vice President Eleanor Yek. So here is today's agenda. Okay, so let me introduce Eleanor Yek, the moderator of the event today.
Good morning and welcome. We hope that all of you will be able to stay with us throughout the whole program, but I do wish to point out to you, please move on to the next slide, some tips for making the experience worthwhile and good for all of us. We'd like to suggest that all attendees mute yourself during the webinar so that we don't hear background noise. We are going to have a short poll at the very beginning of this presentation, and you will notice it will come up on your screen, and we'll be asking you to just click yes or no. But more importantly, throughout the presentation, as you're listening, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat room. If you look at the bottom of your screen now, there's a box called chat. You click on that, and a column will come up and you can type in your question. And at a later point in the presentation, we will be looking at those questions and presenting them to our two presenters today. If we have many questions, the League members who are looking at them may group some of them together, and then we'll present them to our speakers. So let me begin by introducing our first keynote speaker. Next slide, please. We are thrilled to have Ann RAVEL with us here today. Ann RAVEL, again, we are honored that Ann is serving this year as Vice President of our League of Women Voters of Southwest Santa Clara Valley. She is a professor at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. She was the former chair of the California Fair Political Practices Commission and the former commissioner of the Federal Election Committee appointed by President Obama. Ann will begin our program with some brief highlights of voter suppression throughout our history. Welcome, Ann, and thank you very much for joining us. Ann, you're muted. There you go.
Okay, sorry for that. So as everyone knows, the issue of voter suppression has become a very divisive issue in this country today and has been for many years. So we want to start the program with a poll with 3 questions, and we ask you to respond to those questions, and then we'll, I think that we'll be providing, Eleanor will be providing the outcome of that poll and maybe have a little quick discussion about that. So the first question in the poll is, do you think that voter suppression has really existed in the United States?
Amy, could we see that poll, please?
Sophia, can you activate the poll because you're the host?
So we'll wait another 30 seconds and hopefully everybody who's participating will be finished.
So if you cannot access the poll, feel free to type your answer in the chat room. I know some people may have issue finding the answer button of the poll. Feel free to type it on the chat room.
Okay. I think we'll stop the poll now. And it's very interesting looking at the results so far.
We haven't, hold on, we haven't showed the results.
The results are actually coming up on my screen.
Because you're a co-host.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So we'll stop the poll and can we see the results?
Yes.
So it looks like we're preaching to the choir here because 100% of the participants feel that voter suppression does exist. 100% who participated feel that there is actually concerted efforts to suppress certain groups. And the last question, I don't see the responses here. Do you think a specific kind of voter ID is a form of voter suppression?
I think that was 100% as well.
That was 100% as well. Okay. Well, again, Anne, you know your audience, so let's continue on with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
We can now take the poll off the screen.
Yes, I think the audience is going to be with me then because what's essential about democracy and has been since the Federalist Papers and the founders was that there is equal participation of all citizens in the electoral process to ensure that elected representatives respond to the will of the people. As, however, Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And the reality was that, in fact, and throughout the history of the United States, from the early 1800s, women, slaves, the poor, non-landowners, and Native Americans could not participate as citizens. And in part, that was because what the founders did was in Article 1, Section 4 of the US Constitution, basically left all of the issues relating to voting to the states. And those voter suppression tactics then have become a feature of US elections for decades. Today, there is a law, and it's a federal crime, that intentionally deceiving qualified voters to prevent them from voting is voter suppression. But from the Jim Crow laws to the gutting of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, communities of color in particular have been disenfranchised in blatant and subtle ways. After the Civil War, there were 3 amendments that were passed to ensure equality for Blacks in the South. And the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, prohibited states from disenfranchising voters on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But when Reconstruction ended in 1977, there was no enforcement of the law, and the states enacted discriminatory constitutional laws in the states and tests that made it nearly impossible for Black voters to vote. We've all probably heard about this because they have gone on for a long time. Poll taxes were a prerequisite to register to vote in most of the Jim Crow states. And poor Black citizens obviously could not afford to do so, as they knew. And those poll taxes continued until the 20th century, until 1964, but even in the 1965 Act, but in 1964, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia still had poll taxes. And they were then deemed unconstitutional through the ratification of the 24th Amendment. But there was still blatant intimidation and violence to prevent Blacks from voting or registering to vote. Literacy tests were implemented by those who were in charge of voter registrations. And so they were able to discriminate against Blacks, whether those people were literate or not. They asked literacy civics questions such as name 2 of the purposes of the US Constitution, and many Blacks who were required to take the test were descendants of slaves. And so they were not allowed to read or write in many states due to anti-literacy laws. And as a result, almost all Black men were excluded from voting, and white men who could not pass the literacy test were able to vote because of the grandfather clause, which allowed them to vote if their grandfathers had voted before the Civil War. And while white women received the right to vote through the 19th Amendment, it didn't guarantee Black women the right to vote. And in 1920, many Black women were not allowed to vote if they failed to comply with literacy tests. And also in many states, there were whites-only primary elections, which shockingly continued in the United States until they were finally banned in 1944. And Blacks trying to vote were often threatened, lynched, subjected to mob violence. In 1940, only 3% of Black men and women in the South were registered to vote. And these kinds, more direct kinds of voter suppression were banned by the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Civil Rights Act. As I indicated in federal law, voter suppression is defined as intentionally deceiving qualified voters to prevent them from voting, which is a federal crime of voter suppression, and voter intimidation, which is motivated by hostility towards minority protected classes, is also a federal crime. But in 2013, after the Shelby County decision by the United States Supreme Court, which struck down the pre-clearance part of the Voting Rights Act, voter ID laws have been passed in 25 states, and many, many laws which impair the ability of the poor, the disabled, Native Americans with no addresses on Native lands, and students to even be able to register to vote. And a lot of states with those voter ID laws also reduce the hours of state offices where you could receive those acceptable IDs, purposely making it more difficult for these people and minorities to vote. And requiring these IDs has not been, despite what has been said about voter security, but solely to restrict the vote. Many states have restricted registration in many ways by putting special burdens on racial minorities, young people, older voters, and have purged voter rolls based on race. Additionally, and that we know in certain places in the United States, the ballots as well of minorities have been disqualified because the voting officials knew that they came from minority areas of the city or state. Additionally, polling places in minority neighborhoods have been eliminated, making it difficult to vote and resulting in long lines for citizens to be able to cast a ballot. We've all seen those in the particularly in the primary in the presidential election in 2020. It was ridiculous. And many states by legislation have made mail-in and early balloting much more difficult in many states, and permanent disenfranchisement of felons is also a historical and still existing way to disenfranchise voters. And I just want to mention there's now a much more modern type of voter suppression as well. In 2016, a Senate Intelligence Committee report found, as we know, that Russia intervened in the election. And much of what they did was they were able on the internet to target Blacks on Facebook and other platforms with voter suppression, clear voter suppression, by running posts and ads claiming things like the candidates didn't care about Black people, and also to encourage them not to vote. And this was done in fake Blacktivist Facebook pages that didn't really exist. And it was found by studies that in some states that were swing states, Black voting decreased by at least 8% in 2016. But it wasn't just Russia that engaged in this activity. The head of Trump's digital campaign, Brad Pascal, admitted that in 2016 and 2018, he employed strategies to depress voter turnout of minorities by telling them to vote on incorrect days or to vote by text or online, which of course we know you cannot do, or just that their vote doesn't matter. So we know that despite some of the changes in voter suppression, many of them still continue to exist. And I think now what I would like to do, and I may be a little early.
It's okay.
I can keep talking, but I will introduce Mac Heller, who we are really privileged to have Mac here to talk about voter suppression and about his film, which is Rigged. He is the executive producer of Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook, which has been awarded the best documentary film by the 2021 Toronto Film Magazine's online festival. And what I particularly love, and you see it at the bottom of his bio, but it's important, I think, and I really like what he says his mantra is, which is voters should choose their politicians, not politicians their voters. And with that, I will turn it over to Mac.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks everybody for gathering today. And let me especially thank Sophia and Eleanor and the League of Women Voters of Southwest Santa Clara County. If our elections are to be saved, and right now, as I'll tell you in a moment, they are threatened. If they are to be saved, it will be because civic groups got their face in the game. So I applaud everybody who's taken time out of their Saturday morning today to begin yet again to man the defenses of our sacred right to vote. I guess I'd also like to add it's an honor to be on the virtual podium with Anne, whom I have admired for many years, her work on the Federal Elections Commission. Boy, do I wish you were on the FEC now, Anne. Let me tell you what I'd like to do today. First of all, we made a film, Rigged, the Voter Suppression Playbook, that documents the stories of suppressed voters. And by what do we mean by Voter Suppression Playbook? What we mean is that the people in our country who would like to reduce the votes of people of color and young people especially, but essentially people who are going to, in their estimation, vote against them, those people have, over the decades, developed a series of techniques that they have replicated state to state that are effective at achieving their goal of suppressing the vote. And as we started to make the film, we noticed these techniques recurring in numerous state laws, and started to write them down. And it constitutes a fairly extensive compendium of techniques to be used, which we call the Voter Suppression Playbook. The film, which is available for those of you who'd like to take a look, available on Amazon Prime, the Peacock streaming network, and Apple iTunes, goes through 9 or 10 voter suppression plays and takes you into Texas, into North Carolina, into Wisconsin, into Missouri, and shows you how those plays work. What we'd like to do this morning, because we don't have time to show the whole film is 70 minutes, but what we'll do this morning is show you 5 shorter clips, 4 or 5 minute clips that go through 5 of the plays, and we'll roll those in a minute. But the topics of these clips, in the order that we'll play them, are gerrymandering, which, as you know, is configuring districts so as to make irrelevant the votes of certain populations, generally populations of color. So number 1, gerrymandering. Number 2, Anne referred to these, restrictive voter laws, voting laws that, through the institution of new requirements to vote, to register to vote or to vote, frequently restrictive ID laws. Let's require an ID that is not held by the people who we'd like to vote. By the way, did you know that about 10% of the people in this country don't have a driver's license because they don't drive? Why don't they drive? Because they're old, or because they're poor and don't own a car, or because the driver's license costs $35 or requires another ID like a birth certificate that they don't have. Why? Because they're poor, or because they're Black, born in the South in the years before the Civil Rights Act. So number 1, gerrymandering. Number 2, restrictive voter laws. Number 3, these fabricated allegations of voter fraud, which have become very prominent, obviously, in the dialogue of the last year. Number 4, voter roll purges. That is, localities going through voter rolls and cutting from the registration list voters of color on bases that are frequently incorrect. We'll go through that. And number 5, voter intimidation. This is an old one, right out of the Reconstruction era, but finding ways to communicate to people that voting for them is a dangerous thing. So we're going to roll these clips. 4 times 5 minutes is 20 minutes. My colleague Kevin Baines will roll them. And then what I'd like to do very briefly after we roll the clips is update the story from the 2020 election to the present day, because sadly, the Voter Suppression Playbook has added a number of pages since then. So with that, again, thank you. Kevin, please roll the clips. Amy, no sound.
Gerrymandering
Yeah. Oh, you had it for a sec.
involves primarily 2 different methods of dealing with voters of the opposite party. You can pack voters into districts, or you can crack them into districts to make them ineffective.
Texas is as good an example of packing and cracking as anywhere in the country, particularly the Dallas-Fort Worth area. If you look at the map that was originally drawn and approved by the Republicans in 2011. Why would this district from the north that's controlled by Anglos up here in a suburban county, why would it come in to Tarrant County like this? Well, it's because they came in and they picked up Latino voters. And you see that they just very carefully pick up this big group of Latino voters, then come back and pick up another group of Hispanic voters like that. This is a classic cracking of Latino voters. Cracking is taking the people of color and cracking them into as many districts as possible where their vote won't make a difference. Packing is putting as many African Americans or Hispanics into as few districts as possible. This shows district 30, which is this packed district. Well, to get a sense of how packed that district is, we're going to shade both African Americans and Hispanics together. So the Black plus Hispanic population, then in purple, you start to see what's going on. You've got a district here that virtually doesn't have anything in it except purple. Classic way of undermining minority voting strength.
If you favor one side over the other, you can clearly take a right turn on Maple Street and a left turn on Mulberry Street and have a partisan impact. It's also an opportunity for the maximum mischief in the line drawing.
The Republicans are able to draw unbelievably precise districts that maximize partisan advantage, where you have a state where the state is relatively even between the Democrats and the Republicans, and yet the Republicans may win 2/3 or 3/4 of the congressional districts. And that's what we're seeing as a result of redistricting in many states in 2010. The party in power really decides who is going to stay in power. And that's not real democracy. And that's what we have in way too many states in our country right now.
People feel that their vote doesn't count. And gerrymandering makes sure that they feel like their vote doesn't count. Because what happens is you get pushed into a district that is completely safe for one party or the other. And if it's completely safe, why vote?
Now, with their majority secured by gerrymandering, many red map Republican legislatures executed the next power play, passing harsh new voter restriction laws.
What you see is a outcropping across the country of bills in state legislatures that are dominated by Republicans, bills that require new kinds of hurdles that voters have to leap over in order to be able to vote.
In 2011, Wisconsin, a red map state, debated a new voter ID law. The law mandated that those without an acceptable ID, like a state driver's license, would need a birth certificate or passport, social security number, and proof of state residency to vote or register to vote. In short, more hurdles, more bureaucracy, make it harder to vote.
Clerk will read the bill. Senate Bill 7, relating to requiring certain identification in order to vote at a polling place or obtain an absentee ballot, verification of the address of electors, absentee voting procedure in certain residential care apartment complexes and adult family homes, identification cards issued by the Republicans.
I got involved when I was very young. My granddad was a Republican, so I said, I'll be a Republican. And you felt it was kind of like this family. So for me, I think it was a sense of belonging, a sense of, hey, I'm working for something.
In 2011, Todd Albaugh was a Republican staffer. He had a front row seat on the passage of Wisconsin's voter ID law.
The chair of the Senate Election Committee at the time stood up and kind of hit her finger on the counter, and she said, look, we got to start thinking about what this is going to mean if this passes to neighborhoods around Milwaukee and the college campuses. What Senator Lozick was referring is, hey, if we can suppress the college vote, and if we can suppress the minority vote in Milwaukee, gives us a pretty good leg up on any future elections.
Today, this is not a voter ID bill. This is voter suppression. It's voter disenfranchisement. This is voter confusion. This is voter restriction. This is voter discouragement bill.
The term voter suppression was never used in the room, but everybody got the idea what was being said. Just so you could see it on some of these senators, the light in their eye, they got it. Because there are only so many white, straight, old men left. So the only way to win is to scare the shit out of people and to suppress the vote. And I saw it firsthand.
I'm not against voter ID. I'm actually for voter ID. I don't think it's crazy to require people to be who they say they are and to prove it. What I'm against is requiring ID that lots of people don't have.
My name is Molly. If you haven't met me, what I can do is get you everything that you need to vote. Vote Riders is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization and really focus primarily on voter ID. We're going to make sure everybody can vote. We can get you an ID from Wisconsin too, because you need one of those when you go and vote. I grew up in a household where we're encouraged to be civically active and to vote. The bill, that's all you need to vote. And if somebody needs help exercising their fundamental right to vote, we should all be stopping what we're doing and figuring out what we can do as a society to make that better. Because this is about you, this is about the voters, and the people who are impacted. I can vote, but you can't. And then I just wanted to talk about when you want to go back to the DMV.
They want to get the ID.
Zach is one of the voters that I actually met here at First United Methodist Church doing regular community outreach.
I didn't think it would take all this to get an ID to vote. President Obama got elected. I voted then, so ever since then, I've been trying to vote in every election.
Zach had a pay stub, he had his social security card, but he didn't have a birth certificate. Which will hold on to these again.
Okay. We went to DMV and they still told me I need my birth certificate. I felt like I had all the right information. They were trying to just have me go around a ringer just for a birth certificate.
Voter ID laws impact certain demographics. They impact low-income voters. They impact voters of color. They impact first-time voters and voters new to Wisconsin. They impact students. They impact older voters who no longer have a driver's license. Here, they make it very difficult to vote. And based on the legislature's own admission and testimony in federal court, that doesn't seem to be a mistake.
The court heard evidence and concluded that there were 300,000 registered voters in the state of Wisconsin who lacked one of the forms of ID is acceptable under the law.
They're trying to make it where only the rich vote for the rich. I thought it was going to be simple, but it wasn't.
Care about vote fraud, gentlemen, we're fighting it. We could use your help. Hey, if you care about vote fraud, we're fighting it. We could use your help. If you care about vote fraud, gentlemen, we're fighting it. We could use your help. Thank you.
I know a girl who votes 8 times and has $1 million in the bank and is on food stamps to get everything for free.
How do you know she votes 8 times?
Because we know her. She does.
Would you call me later after the election?
Before I launched the Voter Integrity Project, I was a military officer, retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. I became worried that this is a fragile system that depends on people being fair and honest.
If you're worried about vote fraud, here's how we're fighting it tomorrow. We can use your help.
They're hiding something, and we're on to them. And that's the only question. It's not how many, we know they're doing it. The question is how big a deal is it?
Are they really trying to steal an entire nation? Are they really trying to rig elections in so many states that they can determine the outcome of the presidency?
And a lot of people are going through life with blinders on, or like I used to tell people, it's called the toilet paper tube syndrome. You got toilet paper tubes in front of your eyes, and all you see is that little bit of world right out in front of you through the toilet paper tubes. You don't see what all's going on out here. So if you're looking right here and you're not looking for voter fraud, you won't see voter fraud.
Republicans saw an opportunity where they could go into states and build this notion of voter fraud, get people scared about it, scared enough that they would create new laws that would heighten the threshold to qualify to vote and make that qualification so difficult that it would suppress voters, and not coincidentally people who would vote against them. It's just a very well-organized, well-staffed, well-resourced operation that once they get an idea, they can spread it like a dandelion.
All we're trying to do is protect voter integrity.
We ought to protect election integrity.
Voter integrity
is at stake.
How can you be against election integrity?
There's a lot of people around the country that use this slogan.
We need to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat.
We want to make it easy to vote.
It's very easy to vote. And we also
believe it should be hard to cheat.
We try to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat.
Because every time a non-citizen votes, it cancels out the vote of a U.S. citizen.
Every non-citizen who votes
cancels out a legally cast ballot.
Every time voter fraud occurs, it cancels out the vote of a lawful citizen and undermines democracy. Can't let that happen.
You didn't have all this talk about fraud until all of a sudden African Americans and Latinos began to vote in record numbers.
I've called some of the people who advance these arguments without good evidence, members of the fraudulent fraud squad, and they go around making claims that voter fraud is rampant without good evidence to support it. So, and what's the end game? The end game is passing new restrictive voting laws.
I'm Chris Kobach. In order for we the people to take our country back, we need to have fair elections. I will stop voter fraud in Kansas. We need to require photo ID when people vote.
Every state needs a Chris Kobach.
You know, our campaign had an undeniable, unmistakable message: stop voter fraud.
And so what Chris Kobach has been able to do is, while drawing a government salary, devote himself to the advancement of policies that are utterly irrational and that have no basis in evidence.
Could you please define voter fraud?
When people say voter fraud, it encompasses a large number of potential crimes. You might be a person who's not a U.S. citizen registering. Then there's crimes on election day, which include things like double voting, voting in more than one state, voting under someone else's name, voting a fictitious identity. The fictitious identity problem, is significant in some states. Actually, voter fraud is substantial in Kansas.
You only proved 9 cases.
No, well, but here you get, so the cases we've prosecuted are just in the last 2 years using a very small legal staff. We haven't prosecuted all the cases that we could have if we had more attorneys, and we haven't prosecuted all of the many cases that we will never discover.
Despite prosecuting few voter fraud cases, Kobach still upped the ante.
We are also going to have proof of citizenship at the time people register to vote.
We obviously agree with people who say we need to prevent ineligible people from registering or voting. But the question is, if you have a hangnail, do you amputate your finger?
My name is Michael Evan Hires. I'm a 100% disabled veteran. I'm not married. I have the time, I have the skills, and have a desire to make sure that every American vote is legally cast.
The Voting Integrity Project is interesting. They've always had a bit of a gadfly, renegade, vigilante voter fraud, crusaders. They claimed that thousands of non-citizens were voting in the state where they would challenge voters at county boards of elections, and then they couldn't prove that really any of those were true.
Is there anyone in the audience today who received a notice that if they wished their name not to be removed from the voter rolls, they should be present? Stand up then and give us your name, please.
Randy Burkett.
Okay, sir. John.
Well, North Carolina has a provision where a citizen can challenge the right of another citizen to vote. It's been on the books forever. Who else is going to know who's registered to vote unless another citizen does it?
Some of the laws that wind up being discriminatory today had discriminatory intent when they were first written in the early 1900s as part of the Jim Crow laws. For example, voter purging laws to cleanse the rolls.
And this was typically used in the Jim Crow era by whites who were trying to prevent newly enfranchised African Americans from having access to the ballot box.
Michael's methodology involves finding voters that the state identified as inactive.
These people have missed 2 federal elections, so they were listed as inactive. And I started sending letters to these inactive voters on the Cumberland County voter rolls.
The ones that came back marked by the post office as undeliverable are considered evidence that the voter no longer resides at that address. And Mike challenged those voters.
Voter challenge envelopes were marked "Do Not Forward." If a resident moves in the district, even across the street, he or she will not receive the notice their registration is being challenged, or even know to come to the Board of Elections hearing to contest the challenge.
What the letter essentially says to Pyramid maintain my voter registration as it is currently today.
Whoever this guy is has challenged my right to vote. The only way to defend your registration was to go in person. The process heavily favors the person doing the challenging. Not everybody is going to get a letter or have the time to defend it.
I love the vote. It was instilled in us to vote. My grandma raised me up and my sister up to vote. You know, when we turned 18, that was our right. The address when I'm registered was 7660 Bridgewood Circle.
I'm gonna have you go and stand in that line so they can update you.
Okay.
All right. Next voter, please.
Hello, Michael Evan Hires.
If you'll just verify that your address and information is correct, you can sign at the bottom for us, please.
There you go. Thank you very much.
I need a picture ID.
I got an old one until I
see what you have. Karen, is this your address?
No, ma'am.
Okay, do you have something with your address?
I'm at the banking place. She told me I could not vote at all because I got to re-register because I'm nowhere in that system. They're not making it easy at all. It's tiresome, yeah.
Is there a possibility that people got struck from the rolls mistakenly because the post office did not appropriately deliver the mailings to them? There is a small possibility on that.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give concerning this matter shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. All the evidence shows that when someone is purged from the rolls, it's extremely unlikely that they're going to re-register. It's hard to get them to re-register. And I worry that it will diminish the will to participate in the political process.
And the danger is if states use unreliable information to take voters off the rolls, and if they do not give voters adequate notice and an opportunity to contest their removal, then we could have a situation where hundreds or even thousands of legitimate voters are being taken off of the rolls without their knowledge.
The whole idea is to make voting seem like a dangerous proposition, that it's something that might get you in trouble. And again, what that does is over a period of time, it insulates Republicans against the effect of African American Hispanic population growth.
In Edwards County, Texas, we received reports that the local sheriff who's connected to the militia movement and who prides herself on being, you know, this tough cowgirl sheriff, she had actually engaged personally in efforts to intimidate voters.
The issue of voter fraud has been very prevalent since I've been here. They're tired of, you see it, you know it, everybody around you knows it. Why isn't someone doing something about it?
Who's 814?
Frank Hill.
814, how long has he been here?
He's been here since the first of the month.
Since the first of the month?
Yeah.
The sheriff has alleged people voting incorrectly that have not. She has threatened to investigate people for illegal voting that have not. She has someone in jail now.
I'm not guilty of nothing because I did the right thing. As I went to go do it, I asked.
The gentleman is under arrest for voter fraud and voter impersonation. He's accused of impersonating his grandfather. There's no way a 40-year-old man is going to be mistaken for someone who's almost 100 years old.
In the first case, he went to prison for delivery of a controlled substance. Once he was on parole, he pretty much knew he wasn't supposed to vote. It was just probably catch me if you can or ha ha ha. I don't really know the motive behind it. I guess maybe one day he'll tell us. But at this point, he's just kind of trying to play the victim.
I do feel that it was a mistake that was done by the ladies working the poll in not actually comparing the date of birth. The date is clearly stated on the registered list as 8/9/1915.
Now, Manuel was on parole. He should not have voted, but the election officials shouldn't have allowed it either. He asked if he could vote. That tells me that he didn't know if he could or not.
The intimidation comes in the arrest itself. Him sitting in jail would send a very strong message to a lot of people and intimidate a lot of people as to not to go out and vote.
When we throw this sheriff out, this intimidation will come to a stop. This is voter suppression, and it's illegal. You have the exact same power in this election as I do, as the person next to you. And you have, together, a whole lot more than Pam Elliott does.
Are you ready? Texas, our Texas, so wonderful, so great.
I just want to thank everybody here. This election has been, and I hate to say it, horrible. Horrible, horrible, horrible. Horrible things being said, horrible mud being slung, all in an effort to rid Edwards County of little old me.
You have leg restraints, or? Because I think Sheriff wanted him in leg restraints.
So, Sheriff, she has been diligently trying to root out the corruption ever since she took office over here. She already has. We've had more arrests ever. Perhaps this might make some of the people who are entertaining the idea of voting illegally, it may wake them up and say, hey, they're not going to let me get away with it if I get caught.
This county has the highest rate of voter fraud allegations with the Secretary of State and Attorney General's office than any of the other 254 counties in the state. Houston's got 10 million people in it. We've got 1,100, and we have a higher rate of voter fraud? Please.
Okie doke. Let me, Eleanor, take a few minutes to update when we finish the film to the present day, because it's deja vu all over again. Obviously, gerrymandering, which is the effort to draw division lines so as to reduce the power of the vote of certain populations. Redistricting is going on right now. And you can see that there were dogfights over the census. Now in many state capitals, there are dogfights over the drawing of district lines. And the state legislatures, which were a focus of Republican effort back in 2010, and they won many seats and were able to control the redistricting process in a number of states at that point, and that control has given them 10 years of favorable districts in those states. And that advantage obviously carries forward indefinitely, because the new redistricting will be done by the new state legislature, which has been elected by the same old districts. So that is a sin committed by both parties. I will say that one is much better at it than the other, and it's anti-democratic. A positive thing is that in a number of states, the citizens have become so tired of this, California obviously one of them, that they've taken the redistricting away from the state legislature and put it in the hands of nonpartisan, citizen-led commissions. Michigan, Utah, Colorado, there's been a wave of this over the last few years. That's a positive development. There's been litigation in a number of those states where the Republicans have sued to negate the citizen-led condition and put redistricting back in the hands of the partisan legislature. I'm going to skip around here. Voter fraud. It'll take me a minute to, I can't update entirely on what's gone on over the last year, but the allegations of fraud about the 2020 election have been breathtaking in scope and breathtaking in the absence of evidence. Here we are a year later. Does voter fraud occur? Yes, it does. But it is a crime almost universally committed by knuckleheads and politicians. What do I mean, knuckleheads? You saw the Chris Kobach clip where he prosecuted 9 people. Well, 8 of those were older white people in Kansas who also owned property in an adjoining state, either Arkansas or Colorado. And told the court that they thought that if they owned property in both states, they could vote at least in local elections in both states. I don't know if those were authentic arguments or not, but voter fraud occurs when it occurs in ones and twos. People who have a sick spouse or parent and improperly fill out and sign their absentee ballot. A woman in North Carolina whose mother on her deathbed said, please fill out my early voting ballot, my absentee ballot, and vote for Trump. This is a 2016 case. You have my power of attorney and I want you to do it. The daughter does that, of course, in the normal election review process. It's discovered. The daughter, to her credit, tells the court what she did, and the DA didn't prosecute that one. But I've investigated not every, but substantially every instance of a voter fraud indictment over the last 6-8 years, and they're almost entirely crimes like that. The allegations made by the former president about the 2020 election, to my knowledge, are 100% without substance. I'm guilty frequently of listening to him more carefully than I think he listens to himself. But I was an election observer in Michigan and have some substantial experience with Michigan voting and Michigan, that day after the election in downtown Detroit, I was there, where the allegation was that the Republican observers were not allowed to observe. Well, that's not right. There were too many observers from each party, and a certain number was let in, and everybody else was kept out. So were some kept out? Sure. And a bunch were let in. Anyway, I won't take any more of our time chasing that around. Voter roll purges, and I want to give a shout out to the League of Women Voters, are a thing. This is a really easy way for the bad guys to cancel out not 10 votes, but 100,000 votes. I'll give you the example of my home state of Ohio, where the Secretary of State developed a list based on, in the opinion of most experts, faulty criteria of about 235,000 votes to be purged, voters to be purged from the voting rolls because they hadn't voted in 2 federal elections. By the way, you didn't hear in those criteria the question as to whether they were alive, a citizen living in the county, which are the qualifications to vote. And the League of Women Voters of Ohio stepped in and said, hey, could we take a look at that list before you cut their names off? Because the league knows what Cheryl Eiffel said, which is that once you purge somebody, especially when they haven't voted in 2 elections, it's unlikely that they're going to register again. And the league went through the list with some allies and found that, I won't remember my numbers exactly, but out of the 235,000, something like 37,000 were alive and living in the county. The others had died or moved away. So through negligence, either intentional or not, the Secretary of State was about to purge 37,000 of our fellow citizens in the great state of Ohio who thought they would be registered to vote. And then you go to vote the next time and the person tells you, sorry, you're not on the registration list. And you say, well, I'll just go over here and register to vote now, to which they say, sorry, in our state, voting registration ends 30 days before the election. So these provisions frequently tie together. I want to pause on voter intimidation, and then I'm going to add one more play to the playbook and talk briefly about this. Voter intimidation, the physical stuff out of the Jim Crow era is still there and getting worse. Many of these new state laws are designed to free up poll watchers to cruise around any part of a polling place and gain access to being able one by one to challenge the credentials of any voter. And if that just happens to be any African-American voter, well, that's up to them. And so the trend in these new voter suppression laws that you've heard about being discussed or passed in many of our states, many of them contain provisions to allow at the polls voter intimidation. But the bigger trend in voter intimidation is obviously online. And the number of indictments have come down over the last few months of people, and they're not all Russians, many of them are Americans, promulgating through Facebook groups provisions like the following: that if you vote by mail, the Secretary of State will give the vote by mail list to the DA, and anybody with any outstanding warrants in their for anybody in their household will receive a knock at the door. And again, going back to the comment in the film, the idea is to make voting seem like a dangerous thing, or there will be citizenship checks. Latino voting in South Texas, registration and voting run 10-20 points behind Anglo voting in those counties. So voter intimidation continues its old life from big white guys carrying guns at the polls, and has a new life online. Let me add one page to the voter suppression playbook, and then Eleanor, maybe we can open it up to questions to both Ann and me. And that is what Rick Hasson, the UC Irvine professor in the film, calls election subversion, which is, after you've been through all the stages of voter suppression, make it difficult to register to vote. If people are registered, make it hard to stay registered by purging their name. If they're still registered to vote and try to vote, make it difficult to vote through all the things we've talked about. If they vote, don't count the ballot. That's mostly a vote by mail thing. You didn't sign it, you didn't put the zip code down, whatever it is. Or if you have to count the vote, make sure it doesn't matter through gerrymandering. But if all that doesn't work, then just reject the vote altogether. And that's what was recently attempted, obviously, in Georgia, and what many people are writing now will be attempted in a number of states at the next presidential election. That's what was discussed in serious terms on January 6th in the White House discussions before the counting of the electoral votes in the Congress led by Vice President Pence. And obviously, it's a very dangerous anti-democratic trend indeed, vote subversion. It's not just this big, spectacular national level thing we read about in the Congress on January 6th. It also can take place at the state level and at the county level. And there are efforts to empower boards of elections to cut out counties, precincts on the theory that those votes are tainted. One of our US senators called into a county in Georgia, this was not a senator from Georgia, and asked whether, if there were a certain number of mail-in ballots that had improper signatures or some other defect to them, whether all mail-in ballots from that county could be disqualified. So I encourage the League of Women Voters everywhere you operate, and I know I'm just talking to one chapter here, but this is a grassroots effort to be fought at the grassroots. The effort is to disqualify and exclude whole groups of votes or whole geographic areas up to and including whole states. And it's dangerous and outrageous and un-American, and we need to stop it. So with that, you now understand our concept of the voter suppression playbook, this whole list of provisions and techniques and dirty tricks that anti-democratic forces can use to subvert and cancel our democracy. So it is threatened. And Eleanor, back to you, and let's talk about it as a group.
Thank you very much. Thank you and Anne for your presentation. Certainly hearing some very upsetting information and some statistics that I think we all do need to be aware of. I do have a number of questions in the chat. Some of them came in just to me, so they're not showing up on the whole chat line. And I also want to encourage members of the audience, if you haven't submitted a question yet, feel free to do so, and I can continue to monitor that chat room. I guess the first question I want to ask is a very general one, and then I have some specific ones. I mean, in your presentation, Mac, you seem to mention certainly the Republican Party a lot, because currently we're just seeing evidence of activity on their part probably. But would you say that other parties have been equally guilty over the years of trying to implement some voter suppression, whether it's legislation or activities?
Look, picking up from Anne's comments earlier, obviously it was the Democratic Party in the South that suppressed votes to the best of their ability from after the Civil War until 1964-65. And many of these techniques were invented, implemented by the Democratic Party. White people's primaries, Democratic Party. I could go on and on. 1965 was 56 years ago. And picking it up from the present day, I think, and Anne, I'll be interested in your comment on this. The Democratic Party has been guilty of gerrymandering in a few states. The Republicans control more states. All the challenges of these citizen-led, nonpartisan redistricting commissions have been executed in Republican states. And so that's gerrymandering. Both sides do it. I'm not saying they do it equally, but on all the other elements of the voter suppression playbook, the voter ID laws specifically designed to require IDs that certain groups don't have. The Chris Kobach, make it difficult to register. The voter purges in Florida, many other places. The substantial movement now to make it difficult for young people, especially college students, to vote. I don't know enough to know that the Democratic Party never does those, but that is substantially a Republican movement today.
Thank you. And Anne, do you want to add to that?
Well, I know that there's, and I agree with Mac on this, and I think that that's the case. I know that after the Obama election, a lot of Republicans understood that it was the increasing, sorry, that's my dog, increasing number of young people who were becoming Democrats and more liberal, as well as others of people of color who were voting and had voted for Obama. And so many of these new voter suppression techniques and activity, and I think he's right about Democrats having participated in, certainly in trying to change lines. There's no question about it. But the other things are not part of the Democratic playbook at the moment, because yes.
Right.
Well,
Thank
I
you.
mean, and Eleanor, we can just look at the activity in the Senate right now. Schumer is going to bring on Monday to a vote a very substantial and very important Voting Rights Act. So far, these bills have received 0 Republican votes and 100% or close to 100% Democratic votes. I will note that when the Voting Rights Act, which was passed in 1965, was renewed 4 or 5 times in the years after that, because it had various sunset provisions. Most recently, in 2006, when it passed the Senate, I'm going to say 98 to 0, 96 to 0. Every Republican obviously voting for it, including that famous Democrat turned Republican, Strom Thurmond. So with all Republicans voting against efforts to renew for instance, the John Lewis Voting Rights Renewal Act that was in the last Congress, that places the entire Republican Party to the wrong side of Strom Thurmond. And I can't get my head around that.
Yeah. I also think while it's not exactly relevant to that, but clearly the decisions in the Holder case, which was accomplished because of a Supreme Court that had changed composition because of Republican appointments to the Supreme Court.
Right. And one of our questions that just came in actually related to that, it said, why doesn't the US Supreme Court help resolve these issues of voter suppression? And so, I think what people become aware of is the importance certainly of who we elect, but also who gets appointed to the Supreme Court and how all of these tie together. But another big area that I see coming up a lot about voter suppression is our criminal justice system and people who have been convicted of a felony or people who are out on parole not being allowed to vote or not having the right to vote. Could you comment on that a little bit? Because I know there was a big case in Florida where the league was very involved and got some legislation passed, which enfranchised many, many Floridians. And then it went back to the legislature, and the legislature overturned that and turned around and disenfranchised all of these either ex-convicts or people who were currently on parole. So could you comment on that?
Go ahead, Mac. Well, yeah, I'll follow you.
Yes, a moment on the historical background here. Felon disenfranchisement is to a great extent a creature of Jim Crow. Frederick Douglass once commented that there were 55 crimes for which a Black man could be convicted of a felony, where a white man doing the same thing could not. And in certain southern states in the late 1800s, a number of statutes, for instance, vagrancy, number of crimes were created, criminal statutes created so that Black men could be arrested, convicted, disenfranchised. This was part of what they called cleansing the voter rolls. The implication being that African Americans on the voting rolls were somehow dirty or unclean. Those laws persist in many of our states, Florida being one. And in Florida specifically, if you were convicted of a felony, you could never vote. The legislature declined to change that. A citizen initiative passed by a vote of 64% a few years ago, thus enfranchising, what do you think, 10,000, 20,000, 1.6 million Floridians who were disproportionately people of color. And as you say, the legislature passed legislation saying, no, the courts said that doesn't work. But then the legislature said, well, you have to pay all fines and fees before you can vote. And what they didn't do was create a single authority to calculate what Joe Smith's fines and fees were. And by the way, if Joe Smith pays the $800 that he thinks he owes, registers to vote, and it turns out some other county says that he owes them $100, he's committed another felony. Back in the can you go. And so the actual people re-enfranchised by this was a small percentage of the massive number that the citizens of Florida wanted to re-enfranchise. There are some great efforts beyond the litigation by the League of Women Voters, by the ACLU, to raise money to pay these fines, to get local governments to waive these fines. But the Florida legislature understands the numerical import of the people to be re-enfranchised here and is fighting it tooth and nail. Their experience has shown, look, voting correlates across our country with affluence and education and all other societal indicia of success, employment, absence of felony conviction. And so the Florida legislature knows that they're going to win a long arm wrestling contest here, because these are not affluent people who can fight these battles a long time. These are people fighting to get a job, fighting to have a place to live, and fighting to be able to vote drifts down the list over time.
Mm-hmm.
And the legislature knows that.
Mm-hmm. Anne, do you want to add anything? And then we're going to move on.
Yeah, well, what I want to add is I too do election observations, and I did one in Puerto Rico. And in Puerto Rico, they actually set up polling places in the jails and allow people who are there to vote. And it makes eminent sense to do that, because these people at some point, hopefully, are going to be able to be citizens again, be out in the community, and to disenfranchise them will make them feel less part of the community. So I think that is really something remarkable and very upsetting that people insist on disenfranchising the felons and others.
Eleanor, can I reach back on your comment on the Supreme Court, one of the audience comments?
Yes.
It is a mistake to imagine that the federal courts generally and the Supreme Court in particular are a safe haven for voter rights in the United States of America. It is a mistake. Those of us of a certain age, Ann and I went to law school about the same time. The courts were heroic defenders of our democracy at that time. But when you look at what's happened, the Supreme Court has many cases, but I'll highlight three that have been important advances against democracy. Citizens United, affirming the use of dark money in our nation's elections. A case called Rucho, in which the court said, gee, partisan gerrymandering seems like a bad thing, clearly anti-democratic, but we're not going to do anything about it. And then, of course, Shelby County versus Holder, which gutted the key provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and opened the floodgates for Texas, North Carolina, and other states to pass voter suppression laws. All three of those are within the last 10 years. All three of those opinions were authored by my contemporary, John Roberts. And to imagine that the Supreme Court is a safe haven for voting rights is a mistake.
Thank you for reiterating that. And Anne wants to, I know, second that. And Anne, the film she monitored us for us one time was Dark Money. And again, for people who haven't seen that film, that's eye-opening, and I would highly recommend that. It's really time for us to move on. You know, at the beginning of this program, when we did our poll, we discovered that we were, quote unquote, talking to the believers who know that voter suppression does exist. And I think the big question for all of us is, what can I do about that? I mean, what can I as a citizen do about that? What can we as a community do about that? What can we as the League of Women Voters do about that? So Anne, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about that.
Right. Well, first off, I think Max said some things about what leagues have been doing that I think is something that this league could also get involved in. But I also, some of the things that we have here on the screen about watching the full version of this film would be really good. Get other people involved, encourage other people to watch the movie. I also think that, well, some of the poll observers and processing of the ballots, some of that is not done positively. The league members could certainly be involved in doing that, in making sure, because I know I've had conversations with Shirley Weber, who she's concerned about voter suppression, even in California. And so I think it's very important for league members to get involved with that as well. Certainly, we should also encourage our legislators to support the Freedom to Vote Act. And that's something that you know is kind of possible for everyone to, not that it's going to pass, but nonetheless, it's worth trying to do that. And I also think that league members could be very active in registering and encouraging young people to vote. And I know there's some schools activities around that, and league members could become involved in that and make sure that the schools are continuing to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mac, do you want to add anything on to that? What can myself as an ordinary citizen, what can I do about this?
I think this list that you've got is terrific. You know, elections are never very far away, and there are a whole, you know, it's tricky being a California advocate of voting rights, right? Because you look around and this state's extraordinary. As Anne says, it's not perfect, but it's extraordinary in the welcoming nature of the voting process. There is an organization called Sister District that in the last election was very effective at finding communities in California with an excess of people who want to help affirm the right to vote, and pairing that town, that group, with a district in North Carolina, Missouri, Texas, somewhere, Pennsylvania, particularly active. And there are other organizations doing it as well. There's a lot of organizations focused on the youth vote. Gen Vote is one that I've been active with, that are focused on registration, focused on fighting these new laws in a number of states, New Hampshire being a good example, that are deliberately making it difficult for college students to register and to vote in that state. You know, in Texas, Texas and Florida, they used to have polling places in a college, no longer have them because they engineered a requirement that there be this many parking spaces near every polling place. You know, seems like a reasonable thing, except on a college campus. So I would get involved with those that are active in states where they need to be active, and you'll have to work across state lines.
Okay, thank you. And I did want to point out specifically, if you could go back one slide, Amy, that what I found really interesting was on your website, the Rigged Film website, there's 7 easy steps for democracy. So I'd encourage everyone to go and take a look at that. I found them helpful to read. Thank you so much, Anne and Mac. We're not quite finished because I know, Anne, you wanted to share some pictures that you've taken because you have done voting, you have done observation in other countries. And I know when you and I have spoken, I mean, and I said to you that, you know, maybe I'm the typical naive American who thinks, oh, the United States is so great and we do all of this stuff and we're trying to provide all this access. And then it's kind of shocking to find out that, guess what? Other countries are doing maybe a better job. So Anne, if you could just take a moment or two to comment on some of these pictures here. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, this is something called Voto en Casa in Ecuador. And the elections officials bring, as you can see, to those people who are disabled or seniors who can't leave the home to vote, they bring a voting place to them. And they also have a secure box which is the typical box that's used in voting locations, so that these people can vote. And if anybody asks for it, they will receive it. This is one example of the kinds of things that are done in many of the countries that I've observed in Latin America. For one thing, many of these countries have universal voting. And so what they believe is that voting is a requirement of citizenship. And so people have to register, they have to, and many of them are automatically registered by census rolls and the like. And if they want not to vote because they have a valid reason, they can often provide that reason, but otherwise they have to go to a voting place. They don't have to vote necessarily. Many of them just sort of cross out the ballot. But nonetheless, they are encouraged to vote as part of their citizenship. And the one other thing that I think is important, in addition to what they've done in Puerto Rico that I saw in jails, they also actually took ballots to people who were in hospitals and could not vote. And I observed people bringing a ballot, helping people if they wanted it, and then taking them back. So many of these countries, and there's so much more to say about this, and it could be a whole other program about how forward-thinking countries like Mexico are in their laws relating to voting and relating to the ability to run for office and what the requirements are and who can get removed if they should be removed from the ballots. But that's a kind of different issue. But what you see in these countries is they are way more forward thinking than the United States is.
Thank you so much, Anne, for your comments today. And Mac, thank you so much for joining us today. And I encourage everybody to watch the full version of Rigged. I learned a lot from viewing it and became enraged at certain parts. And so knowledge is your best tool. And to know that voter suppression does exist, to look at legislation and ask yourself, what are the unintended consequences of this? Who is it going to impact is an important approach to take. And now I'm going to turn our program back to our president, Sophia Cao. Sophia?
Hi, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our presenter, Anne and Mac, for taking your time out of a very busy schedule to meet with us today. We hope that you gain great insight from today's program. We will upload today's presentation to our website. And for those who register today's event through Zoom, you will receive a follow-up email with the presentation and the recording. So if you have not done so, can we go to the next page? Yeah, please connect with us through our website, and here's a link to a couple of our social media platforms. So we may stay in touch and keep you updated about our future programs. Next slide. So today's webinar is the third monthly event planned by our newly formed Racial Justice Committee. So I appreciate the great effort led by this committee members, including Eleanor, Ann, and the Barbara Lees and other members. So next month, we will, next month, the committee is prepared another important topics in November. It will be a Wednesday evening program. It's about criminal justice and the court system reform. So stay tuned and make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter, and we will send you more information about that. Next. Okay, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you again in next event. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.